If you want to know more about a person and what makes them what they are, find out what music they're into, what bands they liked, and I think you'll find quite a bit about them. In my case, there's one band that radically affected me in my early teens, and it was a band that, for me, came out of nowhere. And that band was The Art of Noise. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I can pinpoint down to the second when I first heard of Art of Noise. I'm on the second floor of my mother's home, and in the corner we have a used RCA television. Now we'd call it cathode ray tube, but then it was just a television. There was a music video compilation show playing, with various music videos that in some cases were months old or had just come out. And I first heard the beginnings of the song Close to the Edit, which starts with a sampled and recut of a car starting. The video itself was weird, recorded in some sort of tunnel, a little girl dressed up as a punk, and three grown men wearing eye protection outfits and dressed similarly as they destroy a variety of instruments, including a piano, to the music. I was transfixed. I could not believe what I was hearing and what I was seeing. In every case of something that's unusual that you find, you can usually track down things that came before it, examples that go back decades or even centuries that show that people had this idea before. But the first time that you encounter it, that becomes your moment. And I can remember that a bunch of things came to mind watching this video. First, I needed to know in every single way who this was, and I waited eagerly at the end for the name and the album to appear in the bottom right. At the time, I couldn't know if it was Close to the Edit or Art of Noise that was playing. Both of these went immediately into my mind as something I needed to look up. I didn't have access to record stores or music shops where I was living, but as luck would have it, we were visiting my grandparents, and near where my grandparents lived, there was a city with a small music shop. And with the memory of that band, I went through shelf after shelf of records and cassette tapes, trying to find whoever this was. For those listening, there's a bunch of aspects of this that are completely lost in the modern era. First, the passage of time, that it took so long between me finding the video and ultimately being somewhere I could acquire the music. We were talking days, weeks before I could do it. Next, I had to go through stacks of albums, of record albums, with tabs with letters on them, and then trying to figure out if the band had its own entry or if it was just under a miscellaneous collection at the end of each letter. I didn't know if the band was named Close to the Edit. I didn't know if they were called Art of Noise, so I looked in both sections. And in the miscellaneous section, there was an album called Who's Afraid of the Art of Noise. I saw on the back that it had Close to the Edit, and I ended up buying that record immediately with whatever little amount of money that I had. In another nod to the time, I actually taped the album onto a cassette so I could listen to it in my Walkman when I was at school. And from the moment that I played the first song, A Time for Fear, Who's Afraid, I knew that I had made an incredible choice. My world shifted. I can still remember lying back on my bed with my eyes closed, listening to this song as it remixed samples of explosions and jet fighters and turned them all into a crashing orchestra of noise. This was not music I was hearing on the radio, and certainly not from anybody I knew. It seemed to come from a whole other place, and I couldn't quite understand how it was being generated. I didn't know anything about a Fairlight or how synthesizers worked or how you would do sampling. So to me, it was all incredibly bizarre. Just the sort of thing I needed in my endless quest to be a little bit outside of the norm of my boring daily life. I'm perhaps not entirely equipped to be a good music critic or describe to you exactly why you should or shouldn't listen to one of their albums. It is a piece of its time. Art of Noise was created by a set of engineers who had worked together on a Yes album, along with a variety of other bands, and in doing so, they had built up strange sounds and some experiments using the Fairlight. Combined with the work of a music critic who was able to rewrite the text and verbiage of what they were doing, they created the image of a faceless band creating works that rejected many of the tenets of music and instead became works all their own. The name Art of Noise was taken from an early 20th century artist who had created unusual orchestral pieces that had supposedly caused riots. At the time that I bought their first album, 2 records had come out, and then after that, in the years beyond, they came out with a variety of special editions, special pressings, unusual singles, and I just started buying them all. Dozens and dozens of Art of Noise records, and in doing so, I followed the fortunes of the band. They produced a couple albums with one lineup, then broke apart, reformed under a different record company and released more albums, and continued on until eventually breaking apart, like many bands do. This period of the 1980s was one where I became aware of other bands like Kraftwerk and Yellow. But Art of Noise had been my first unusual band, a cacophony of symphonies and samples and odd sounds, songs where ping-pong balls were the percussion, or where somebody shouting out words was remixed and made lower or higher to create harmonies, combined with an organic bass line or other musical instruments to switch between the unreal and the seemingly real. They maintained their unbroken position as my favorite band. By the time I was through college, in my early 20s, Art of Noise was a distant and happy memory, something I enjoyed when I was younger and which formed how I looked at the world, the idea that you could take things and remix them or mess with technology and samples. All of my tracking work with mod trackers and using computer music comes from being inspired by the Art of Noise. So imagine my surprise when I was 29, in the deepest throes of working in a corporate environment, to find out on the web that there was going to be an Art of Noise tour. It would be a mini tour. It would be stopping in only 4 places in the United States. It was in support of a new album they had made, a complete reimagining of what their music could be. But what made it really interesting was one of the 4 cities was my own. They'd be playing in Boston, an actual club gig that I could easily get to. I immediately bought a ticket. I bought 2, in fact, just in case somebody wanted to go with me. And I immediately picked up this new album. Records and cassettes had long gone by the wayside, and this was a CD. And the songs, while not as experimental and jarring as what I had heard as a kid, were still very beautiful and more oriented towards an orchestral and mixed feel than anything else. They played in a relatively small music club in Boston, where there was a very small stage surrounded by chairs, and then beyond the chairs, raised platforms where there were even more tables and booths for people to be able to order food or be able to get away from the music a little bit before going back down to the floor. I knew from experience that general admission doesn't always mean you get to choose where you sit, so we got there incredibly early, and we ended up sitting in a booth in the back while waiting for the show to start. Laid out in front of me, I had a collection of what I thought were the rarest Art of Noise records, talismans to remind me of where this had all come from and how much of an influence it was. And a number of people stopped by, looked at the albums, and talked with me a while, including one nice fellow who walked up and looked at one of them and held it up and said, "Wow, this really brings back memories." And I said, "Yeah, that's from the Paul Morley artistic expansiveness period." And he looked at me and said, "Huh, yeah, that's a pretty good time." And if you know anything, you know where this is going. As the band started up, that's how I found out that that was, in fact, Paul Morley, one of the original co-founders of the band, and they had done such a good job of hiding their faces and not being photographed that I didn't even know that it was him. I felt really bad. They performed, and it was like heaven for me. They went through all of their songs along with descriptions of why they chose them or what they worked on, and they played songs both from the back catalog as well as some of the newest ones. It was a wonderful time. And while I was standing there on the dance floor and the band had finished, Paul Morley motioned over to me, and I came over and he said, "Hey, would you like to meet the band?" And I said, Yeah, I'd love that. And I took my records and I walked backstage to a tiny little box. And standing there were the members of Art of Noise, my favorite band. They were incredibly cordial and polite and allowed me to just pour out all of the emotions and the connections that they had been for me for over 20 years. As I've said before, what's always impressed me is when somebody is known for something and they meet up with a fan and they give that fan time and space to express what they're having trouble expressing. And that's what they did for me. I let them know where I'd come from, how much their music had mattered to me, and maybe in much less eloquent words told them that they had affected the direction at which I had perceived the world. And I left there, and I went into the Boston night, abuzz, delirious, and bringing a story and an arc of personal growth to a delightful, noisy conclusion. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to James Bekoyanu, Peter Healy, Mark Pilgrim, Corey Thomas, Emilio Oliveira, Matt Reynolds, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I can't imagine most people haven't heard something from the Art of Noise, either their song Beatbox or Close to the Edit or Moments in Love. These have been used in many different locations. They've fallen into the library of easy-to-do cinematic music. But if you haven't, I recommend starting with the album Who's Afraid of the Art of Noise, and then moving over to either Innocence, Nonsense, or the album Invisible Silence, which stands as my personal favorite. Everybody has a band like this. I'm sure you do. I'm sure everyone you know does. The band that makes them gush and talk about everything that band has made them feel. Appreciate them, love them, and recognize them for what they were.